Washington is jubilant, and in Chicago, more than a...
After the events of World War II, a broken and shattered Europe left the democratic United States and the authoritarian Soviet Union as the two strongest countries in the world. After the Potsdam Conference in Germany in 1945, Truman and Stalin both recognized their rivalry for dominance over Europe and Asia. This ideological conflict, the power struggle between capitalism, led by the United States, and communism, led by the Soviet Union, was the central global conflict over the next 40 years. Despite ideological differences, the Allies shared a commitment to building a new organization to promote peace and prosperity to replace the League of Nations that had failed during the war. This replacement organization became known as the United Nations. It was established in 1945 and still persists to this day.
In the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
However, the existence of the United Nations did not prevent tensions from growing worse between the Soviet Union and the West. Winston Churchill characterized these growing tensions by an iron curtain between Western and Eastern Europe. Two major differences between the United States and the Soviet Union was in how they organized their economies and their political systems. In the United States and other capitalist countries, economic assets were privately owned, giving people the freedom to act in their own self-interest. In the Soviet Union and other communist countries, economic assets were owned by the government, trying to emphasize equality and fairness. A second difference was how the rivals organized their political systems. In the US, people chose their elected leaders through free elections and also relied on an independent press to provide information about the government and political parties. In the Soviet Union, elections were not significant, and the press was operated by the government, and a single party dominated politics. Both sides in the Cold War pointed to what it saw as flaws in the other. In the US, people attacked the Soviets for restricting rights of people to speak and worship freely, to elect their own representatives, and to allow businesses to operate efficiently. Soviets accused the United States of giving poor people the freedom to starve, and for discriminating against African Americans and other minorities. The Soviet Union also stressed an emphasis on women's equality as a difference between its system and that of the US's. Despite these differences, certain folks think that the US and Soviet models actually had quite a few similarities. For example, in both, control of large economic decisions was in the hands of groups, either the government or millions of corporate shareholders. Farther, both countries acted out of fear of the other, which made the military a powerful force in each.
They built for aggression and intimidation. The Soviet Union continued to maintain the biggest peacetime army in history.
Both sides in the Cold War wished to expand their system of thought throughout the world. The USSR decided to do this via the use of satellite countries. The countries of Bulgaria, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania were instructed to develop 5-year economic plans focused on developing industry and collective agriculture at the expense of consumer products. All political parties, other than the communists, were outlawed. These actions allowed the USSR to exploit the Eastern European nations to benefit the Soviets rather than to help those countries grow. The satellite countries, that were small states economically or politically dependent on a larger, more powerful state, were forced to import only Soviet goods and to export only to the Soviet Union. Additionally, the governments of these countries were just as dictatorial as the Soviet government. The Soviet Union also fought against capitalism with a concept called World Revolution, a belief that organized workers would overthrow capitalism in all countries. The Soviets supported revolutions and uprisings between 1919 and 1923 in Germany, Bavaria, Hungary, Northern Italy, and Bulgaria. After World War II, growing revolutionary feelings became a serious threat to Western powers and governments in Central and Southern Europe. The USA, however, developed its own ways to fight back. U.S. diplomat George Kennan believed that the Soviet Union would continue to expand its borders and influence abroad if it could. He advocated a policy of containment, not allowing communism to spread farther. He was criticized for upholding the status quo, and certain politicians argued for a more aggressive policy of overthrowing existing regimes in order to roll back the spread of communism. Kennan's reports influenced President Harry Truman. A speech in 1947 outlined the Truman Doctrine, a strong statement that the United States would do what it had to do to stop the spread of communist influence, specifically in Greece and Turkey. The Soviet Union wanted to put military bases in Turkey so it could control the Dardanelles, the strait between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. In Greece, left-wing groups controlled by communists were close to gaining control of the government. Truman pledged U.S. economic and military support to help the two countries resist the communist domination. The Marshall Plan. After World War II, the United States was deeply concerned about rebuilding Europe. The U.S. provided assistance to those countries soon after the war ended. However, many U.S. leaders thought more was needed to get European allies back on their feet economically. Based on the belief that a communist revolution could happen in economically unstable nations, the new goal was to rebuild Europe into a prosperous and stable region. The Marshall Plan, enacted in June 1947, was designed to offer $12 billion in aid to all nations of Europe, including Germany. This money would be used to modernize industry, reduce trade barriers, and rebuild Europe's damaged infrastructure. The plan worked. Economic output in the countries aided was 35% higher in 1951 than it had been in 1938. The Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites refused to participate in the plan. Instead, in 1949, the Soviets developed their own plan to help rebuild Eastern Europe. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon. The scope of the organization was narrower than that of the Marshall Plan. It was limited primarily to trade and credit agreements among the 6 members. Compared to the Marshall Plan, its impact was modest.
A 3-stage rocket. Number 1, the booster in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point reached. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released.
The competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to be the dominant power was evident in the efforts of both countries to get into space first and to create more powerful weapons. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, called Sputnik, into orbit around Earth, inaugurating what would become known as the space race. The United States launched its first satellite in January of 1958. The two nations competed to become the first with a manned satellite orbiting the Earth, and later, the first to land a human on the moon. Early in 1959, the Soviets tested the first intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, capable of delivering a nuclear warhead into U.S. territory. The United States tested a similar missile later that same year. Both countries realized they had become so powerful that they had reached a point of mutually assured destruction. That is, regardless of who started a war, both would be obliterated by the end of it. Since neither side could win a nuclear war, neither side had an incentive to start one. As long as both sides kept improving their technology, the balance of terror between them would keep the peace. Everyone hoped. Gazing upon the rising tensions between the Soviets and the US, many new African and Asian countries wanted to stay out of the US-Soviet Cold War. They wished for an alternative framework for international economic, political, and social order, not dominated by the two powerful countries. In 1955, Indonesia hosted the Bandung Conference for representatives of these countries. Delegates from China, India, and 27 other countries, representing more than half the world's population, passed resolutions condemning colonialism. The impulse that prompted the Bandung Conference led countries to formally organize the Non-Aligned Movement in 1961. However, these countries faced challenges. Member states tried to combine support for stronger international institutions with efforts to advance their own interests. For example, Indian leader Jawaharlal Nehru supported a stronger United Nations, but he opposed its efforts to intervene in the conflict between India and Pakistan over control of the region of Kashmir. Member states often became more closely aligned with one superpower or the other. When war broke out between Somalia and Ethiopia in 1977, the Soviet Union supplied aid to Ethiopia, prompting the United States to supply aid to Somalia. Certain important leaders of the non-aligned movement include the people whose names I'm about to butcher. Here they are: Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and Sukarno of Indonesia. The conflict among the Allies after World War II was exemplified by the debate over how to occupy the defeated country of Germany. The Allies agreed to partition the country among France, Great Britain, and the US, and the Soviet Union. The three Western Allies wanted to combine their zones into one state under democratic principles. The Allies also decided to divide Germany's capital, Berlin, into 4 zones. The 3 Western zones would become a free city that was located within the Soviet zone of Germany. The Soviets wanted to stop those Western plans and control all of Berlin. They set up a blockade of the Western zones in Berlin to prevent the West from moving supplies into the area by land. The Western Allies did not want to risk a military confrontation with the Soviets and ultimately began the Berlin Airlift. Through this operation, the Allies flew supplies into Western zones between February 1948 and 1949, when the Soviets lifted the blockade. After the blockade ended, Germany split into 2 states. West Germany became the Federal Republic of Germany. East Germany became the German Democratic Republic. The division of Europe into East and West was complete. As citizens of East Germany saw the prosperity and democratic lifestyle of West Germany, many wanted to move to the West. Between 1949 and 1961, about 2.5 million East Germans fled. However, the East German and Soviet governments were determined to keep people in East Germany. They knew that the exodus to the West reflected poorly on the communist system, and it was hard on their economy. They first set up barbed wire fences patrolled by guards along the perimeter of East Germany and between East and West Berlin. In August 1961, they began replacing the fences in Berlin with a wall, which became known as the Berlin Wall. Between 1961 and 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, soldiers killed about 150 people as they tried to escape over it. Only a few years after World War II ended, the Soviet Union dominated the Eastern European countries they had occupied during the war. Communist governments in those countries, buoyed by support and the direct influence of Stalin, subjected their people to the same suppression economic system as the Soviet Union. Many Western European countries feared such a dominant communist presence on their doorstep. Out of a desire to coordinate their defenses in case of a conflict with the Soviets, several Western nations created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in April 1949. The treaty pledged mutual support and cooperation within the alliance against conflicts and wars. Its original members were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the US. Membership in this Brussels-based organization expanded considerably in the decades after its founding. The Soviet Union's response to NATO was the Warsaw Pact, created in 1955. Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union were the original members. Warsaw Pact nations combined their armed forces and based their army leaders in Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. These nations were known as the Communist Bloc. 2 countries with communist political systems successfully resisted Soviet control. Albania, located next to Greece, joined the Warsaw Pact but withdrew in 1968. It became more closely tied to China. Yugoslavia, under the authoritarian leadership of Marshal Josip Broz Tito, never joined the Warsaw Pact. In the 1990s, ethnic divisions caused Yugoslavia to break apart into several countries, including Slovenia, Serbia, and Croatia. Other treaty organizations formed in an attempt to halt the spread of communism in other regions include the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, with Australia, France, Great Britain, New Zealand, Pakistan, the Philippines, Thailand, and the United States, and the Central Treaty Organization, CENTO, an anti-Soviet treaty organization formed by Great Britain, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and Turkey to prevent the spread of communism in the Middle East. The US was not a full member, but it joined their military committee. The ideological Cold War was accompanied by hot wars in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. They were called proxy wars because the armies of smaller countries were proxies, or stand-ins, for the two superpowers. These wars often combined specific local issues, such as a battle against colonialism, or for land reform, with the international conflict over the spread of communism. Though proxy wars occurred in small countries, some resulted in millions of deaths. Two of the biggest confrontations were the Korean War and Vietnam War in Asia. In both instances, the countries were split into northern and southern sections. In both countries, a communist government ruled the northern section. Just as the victorious powers divided Germany after World War II, they also divided the Korean peninsula. The Soviets occupied the north, while the US and its allies occupied the south. The Korean War began when North Korea invaded South Korea in an attempt to reunite the country under its leadership. In response, the United Nations voted to defend South Korea militarily. The Soviet Union could have vetoed this resolution, but its representative was absent during the vote, because the Soviet Union was boycotting all Security Council meetings in protest over a disagreement about China's seat on the Security Council. The United Nations military forces supporting the South Koreans came from 16 member countries, but the US provided a large number and the overall commander, General Douglas MacArthur. The Soviet Union did not send troops, but it sent money and weapons to North Korea. The UN forces pushed back the North Koreans across the inter-Korean border and drove toward North Korea's border with China. The Chinese, allies of North Korea and concerned that the UN forces would try to invade China as well, sent Chinese troops across the border and entered the war against the United States and its allies. After 3 years of fighting and some 4 million civilian and military casualties, the war ended in a stalemate. The two parts of Korea remained divided, with a demilitarized zone in between. Vietnam War. U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, following the Truman policy of containment, sent military advisors to South Vietnam to train the South Vietnamese army and prevent a communist takeover by North Vietnam. Eisenhower's successor, President John F. Kennedy, increased the number of advisors from 1,000 to 16,000. Some U.S. citizens believed America could not afford to lose a confrontation in Vietnam. They thought a communist victory would weaken U.S. prestige around the world. However, the United States was supporting an undemocratic and unpopular South Vietnamese ruler, Ngo Diem. In 1963, Buddhist monk Thich Quan Duc publicly set himself on fire in Saigon to protest the South Vietnamese government's favoring of Catholics over Buddhists. His protests inspired others. A military coup, with U.S. support, soon overthrew Diem. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson sent more U.S. troops to South Vietnam. Johnson believed in the domino theory, the idea that if one country in the region became communist, other countries would soon follow. Johnson feared that China and the Soviet Union would bring all of Southeast Asia under communist rule. Angola, the Portuguese colony in Southwest Africa, won its independence in 1975 after 14 years of armed struggle. Like the Vietnamese, the Angolans had to fight a war to end their colonial status. However, Angola faced greater ethnic conflict than did Vietnam. The borders of Angola, like those of many newly independent African countries, had been set by European colonial powers with little regard for traditional regions. Rival ethnic groups were thrown together under one government. Angola was a multi-ethnic empire consisting of 3 distinct cultural groups than a nation-state in which everyone shared a common culture. Each group had fought for independence. Each wanted to control the country's lucrative diamond mines, and each was supported by other countries. The USSR and Cuba backed the Mbundu tribe. South Africa backed the Ovimbundu tribe. The United States backed the Bankongo tribe. Upon independence, civil war broke out. In 2002, after 27 years of fighting, the rivals agreed on a ceasefire. However, threats of violence from militant separate groups remained. Contra War. In Nicaragua, in 1979, the 43-year dictatorship by the Somoza family was ended by the rebel Sandinistas, who called themselves socialists. 2 years later, conservative opponents of the Sandinistas, known as Contras, tried to overthrow them. From 1981 to 1988, the Contra War gripped the country. Wanting to isolate the Sandinistas, the United States heavily backed the Contras with covert support. The Contra War took the lives of tens of thousands of Nicaraguans. The war ended after the signing of the Tela Accord in 1989 and the demobilization of the Contra and Sandinista armies. Fidel Castro and other communist revolutionaries overthrew the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959. Castro soon set up a dictatorship in Cuba less than 100 miles off the coast of Florida. Many people in the United States were concerned about how Cuba's new leader would interact with the country's neighbor to the north. The Bay of Pigs crisis. On August 6, 1960, the new government started to nationalize foreign-owned industries, which was a common communist strategy. Cuba nationalized businesses and properties of the National Telephone and Electricity Companies, Texaco, Esso, and Sinclair Oil Companies, and 36 sugar mills owned by U.S. firms. As a result of these economic losses for its citizens, the United States broke off trade with Cuba and cut diplomatic ties. Castro in turn accepted Soviet aid and aligned Cuba's foreign policy with that of the Soviet Union. In 1961, newly elected U.S. President John F. Kennedy had grave concerns about the presence of a communist country located only 90 miles from the coast of Florida. Before Kennedy took office, a group of Cuban exiles who opposed Castro had asked for U.S. government backing to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. Kennedy gave his support. The resulting Bay of Pigs invasion was a total failure. Even worse for the United States, it cemented the Cuba-Soviet alliance. In response to the Bay of Pigs, the Soviets began to support Cuba with arms and military advisors. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who came to power after Stalin, saw an opportunity in Cuba. In 1962, he shipped nuclear missiles to Cuba. Khrushchev felt justified in his actions because in the summer of 1961, the United States had placed nuclear missiles in Turkey, a U.S. ally that shared a border with the Soviet Union. In October 1962, U.S. intelligence learned that more missiles were on their way to Cuba. Kennedy ordered the U.S. Navy to prevent the missiles from reaching Cuba. He called his action a quarantine because a blockade was technically an act of war. Regardless of the term, the two superpowers were on a collision course that threatened nuclear war. Ultimately, the two leaders pulled back from the brink. Khrushchev called back the Soviet ships and removed the missiles that had been delivered to Cuba. In return, the United States pledged to quietly remove its missiles from Turkey. After this incident, leaders of both countries realized that better communication between their countries was needed. In 1963, the two countries set up a hotline, a direct telegraph/teleprinter link between the US and Soviet leaders' offices. The nuclear arms race spawned a reaction known as the anti-nuclear weapons movement. One of the first such movements developed in Japan in 1954 in opposition to US testing of nuclear weapons in the Pacific Ocean. In 1955, more than one-third of Japan's population signed a petition against nuclear weapons. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the anti-nuclear weapons movement expanded to other countries, particularly the US and Western Europe. On June 6, 1982, some 1 million people demonstrated in New York City against the creation, buildup, and possible use of nuclear weapons, limiting nuclear power. People worldwide worried about deaths and environmental harm from nuclear war or nuclear testing. In 1963, the Soviet Union, the United States, and more than 100 other states signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. France and China did not sign it. This agreement outlawed testing nuclear weapons above ground, underwater, and in space. The goal was to cut down the amount of radiation that people would be exposed to as a result of weapons testing. Underground testing remained legal. In 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty called on nuclear power to prevent the spread of military nuclear technology and materials to non-nuclear countries.